The wind was a raw, unforgiving thing out on the high prairie, cutting across the bone-chilled landscape like a saw blade on frozen timber. Jane Callahan pulled the collar of her worn duster tighter around her throat, the rough wool scratching against skin that was etched with more lines than the map of this desolate territory. Years had passed, marked not by calendars or seasons, but by distance covered and battles fought, both seen and unseen. She had left this place a girl, raw and full of fire. She returned a woman, tempered by iron and ash. It was the autumn of 1887. She had heard the whispers, carried on the wind like scattered dust, whispers of ruin, of men who had taken what wasn't theirs, leaving behind wreckage where life once thrived. This valley, nestled between sharp, unforgiving peaks, had been her home, or what passed for it. Now, approaching the cluster of buildings that clung to the dusty creek bed, it looked like a ghost town that hadn't yet learned it was dead. The buildings sagged, paint long peeled away by sun and wind. Windows were boarded up, doors hung crookedly on their hinges. A stillness lay over everything, heavy and unnatural. It wasn't the quiet of peaceful habitation, but the silence of something broken, deserted, or perhaps worse, simply waiting. Waiting for what, she wasn't sure. But a knot tightened in her gut. The same knot that had pulled her back across hundreds of miles, driven by a cold, persistent ache that time and distance had failed to dull. She dismounted in the middle of the main street, the only sounds the creak of her saddle leather and the nervous shuffling of her mare's hooves on the packed earth. No barking dogs, no children's laughter, no saloon piano tinkling off-key, just the wind and the vast, empty sky. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the doorway of what used to be the general store. It was a woman, gaunt and wary, her face a mask of suspicion. As she emerged fully into the weak sunlight, Jane saw the fear etched deep around her eyes. It was Cora Vance. Cora had been just a girl when Jane left, all wide eyes and shy smiles. Now she looked older than her years, her youth worn thin like the fabric of her dress. Her hand trembled as she clutched the doorframe. "Cora?" Jane's voice was rusty, unused to speaking softly. The woman's eyes widened, fear momentarily giving way to disbelief, then something that looked like terror. "Jane? Jane Callahan?" She didn't sound like she believed it. It's me." Jane took a step forward, then stopped. The space between them felt immense, filled with unspoken years and unknown grief. Cora didn't move from the doorway. She just stared, her gaze sweeping over Jane's battered hat, the twin colts resting low on her hips, the grim set of her jaw. This wasn't the fiery, headstrong girl who rode bareback through the fields. This was someone else entirely. You came back," Cora whispered, the words thin threads against the wind. "I did." Jane's eyes scanned the street, then back to Cora. "What happened here, Cora? Where is everyone? Where's my family?" The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Cora's face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Oh, Jane. It was bad. After you left." She trailed off, unable to continue. Jane's heart, long dormant, stirred with a painful beat. She had seen death, destruction, and despair in her travels, but none of it felt as sharp as the sight of Cora's broken spirit and the desolate silence of her home. "Tell me, Cora," Jane said, her voice low and steady now, the softness gone. "Tell me everything." They stood there for a long moment, the wind whistling around them, carrying the unspoken stories of tragedy. Finally, Cora pushed herself away from the doorframe and beckoned Jane inside. The interior of the store was dark and smelled of damp and decay. Dust motes danced in the few shafts of light that penetrated the grimy windows. Boxes were overturned, shelves bare. It looked ransacked. Cora led her to the back, where a small, flickering fire burned in a makeshift hearth. A single pot of beans simmered, the only sign of recent life. They sat on two upturned crates, the silence stretching between them, thick with anticipation and dread. "It was about a year after you left," Cora began, her voice hesitant at first, then gathering a fragile strength as the words spilled out. "The railroad didn't come through like they promised, and then Amos McBride and Garrett Donovan arrived." She spat the names like bitter seeds. Jane's eyes narrowed. Those names. She had heard them before, mentioned in saloons and camps far from here, always with a shiver of fear or grudging respect for their ruthlessness. Amos, the brains, they said, smooth-talking and cruel. Garrett, the muscle, quick with a gun and slower to think. They weren't alone at first, Cora continued. Had a gang with them, said they were buying up land, starting a proper town, but they didn't buy, they took everything, land, livestock, they ran people out. A cold rage, familiar and potent, began to simmer in Jane's gut. "My family?" she asked, her voice tight. Cora looked away, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "They tried to fight back, Jane. Your father, he always said this land was his, earned with sweat and blood. He wouldn't leave." Jane waited, breath held tight in her chest. They came in the night," Cora whispered, tears flowing freely now. "Torched the cabin. Your mother, your father, they didn't make it out." A sharp, guttural sound escaped Jane's throat, a sound of pain she hadn't allowed herself to make in years. Her hands clenched into fists so tight her knuckles turned white. Her mother, her father, gone. Because of those men. "And the others?" Jane asked, the words clipped and hard. "The townspeople?" "Most left," Cora said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Those who could. Amos and Garrett, they made it clear this was their territory now. They taxed everything, demanded loyalty. Anyone who spoke against them, well," she shivered. "Some disappeared, some ended up like your folks." "And you?" Jane looked at her, seeing the fragile hope and the deep-seated fear warring in her eyes. "My parents are gone too," Cora said softly. "Fever took them the year before the trouble started. I had nowhere to go. They let me stay here in the store. I clean for them sometimes. It's better than starving." "They let you stay?" Jane scoffed. "More like they keep you as a reminder of what they've done." Cora didn't argue. She just nodded, her gaze distant. "They control everything, Jane. The supplies, the water rights, the few businesses that are left. Anyone who tries to make a living, they take a cut. It's like the life has been choked right out of this place." Jane looked around the desolate store, at Cora's thin frame and haunted eyes. This was what was left. A ghost town, oppressed by two men who had stolen more than just land and possessions. They had stolen life, hope, and the very soul of this place. The cold rage solidified into something hard and sharp inside her. Vengeance. It wasn't just a word, it was a promise she made in the silent, grief-filled room. A promise to her dead parents, to Cora, to the memory of the vibrant community this valley once held. "Amos McBride and Garrett Donovan," Jane said, the names heavy on her tongue. "Are they still here?" "Aye," Cora said, fear returning to her eyes. "They built a house up the ridge, fancy place, lording it over everyone. They come into town now and again, collecting their dues, reminding folks who's in charge." "They won't be in charge for much longer," Jane stated, her voice quiet, but carrying an absolute certainty that made Cora look at her with a mix of awe and terror. For the next few days, Jane stayed in the back of the store with Cora. They shared the meager food supply, speaking in hushed tones. Jane, usually tight-lipped about her past, found herself telling Cora small pieces of her life on the move. The endless miles, the rough camps, the constant vigilance required to survive. She didn't speak of the worst parts, the loneliness, the moments when the weight of the world felt too heavy to bear, but just sharing the simpler facts felt like letting a little air into a long-sealed room. Cora, in turn, told Jane about the few remaining families huddled in their homes, living in quiet desperation. Old Man Davies, who wouldn't leave his small patch of ground even after they burned his barn. Martha Shaw, whose husband had tried to organize resistance and disappeared one night. Their lives were defined by fear and scarcity, a constant struggle against the arbitrary cruelty of Amos and Garrett. Jane spent her days observing. She watched the men who occasionally rode into town, rough-looking types, loyal to McBride and Donovan. She watched the way the remaining townsfolk flinched when they passed, the way they avoided eye contact. She saw the suffocating blanket of oppression that lay over the valley. Her initial rage began to temper with a cold, calculated resolve. Vengeance wouldn't be a blind, furious act. It had to be precise, final. It had to dismantle the power these men wielded, not just remove them. She cleaned her Colts meticulously, the metal cool and familiar in her hands. She checked her rifle, oiled the action until it moved smooth as silk. She was battle-hardened, yes, but the real battle was inside her, wrestling with the grief for her family and the burning desire to make those responsible pay. Cora watched her fear slowly giving way to a hesitant hope. Jane was danger, yes, but she was also strength, a force that had returned to challenge the darkness that had consumed their lives. "What are you going to do?" Cora asked one evening as they sat by the fire, the only light in the dead town. "End it," Jane said simply. "But how? They have men, they have guns." "So do I." Jane looked at Cora, her gaze steady. "They took everything, Cora. They thought there was no one left to fight back. They were wrong." A few days later, the word came. Amos McBride and Garrett Donovan were coming into town the next morning. They were collecting the autumn tithe, as they called it, another demand for goods or money from the few who had managed to scrape by. Tension hummed in the air. Jane felt it, a low, thrumming energy beneath her skin. Cora was pale, her eyes wide with dread. "You should go, Cora," Jane said that morning, as the sun began to paint the eastern peaks with pale light. "Get away from here, now." Cora shook her head, clutching her thin shawl around her shoulders. "No. This is my home too, Jane, what's left of it. I won't be run out." Her voice was small, but held a new firmness Jane hadn't heard before. Jane looked at her, seeing not just the fearful woman she had found, but a flicker of the resilience that must have allowed her to survive alone in this desolate place. A grudging respect stirred within her. "All right," Jane said. "But you stay out of sight, understand?" Cora nodded, her gaze fixed on Jane. Jane took up a position in the dusty general store, positioning herself near a broken window that offered a view of the main street. She waited, the Colts heavy in her holsters. The air outside was still, the silence of the town more oppressive than ever. Presently she heard the sound of horses. 2 riders, Amos McBride and Garrett Donovan. They rode slowly into town, surveying the desolate street with an air of arrogant ownership. Amos McBride was a slick-looking man, even in dusty plains clothes. Clean-shaven, with eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that seemed perpetually curved in a condescending smirk. Garrett Donovan was bigger, rougher, his face scarred, his hand resting habitually on the butt of his revolver. They dismounted in front of the saloon, tossing their reins carelessly to one of the men who had ridden in with them, a burly fellow named Hank, one of the few remaining loyalists. "Quiet as the grave," McBride said, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness. "Just how I like it." Donovan grunted, scanning the empty doorways. "Folks know their place." Jane's grip tightened on the windowsill. She could feel her heart pounding, but her hands were steady. This was it. The culmination of years of pain, of distance, of simmering rage. She stepped out of the store, walking deliberately into the street. Her boots crunched on the gravel. The sound echoed loudly in the silence. McBride and Donovan froze, turning towards her. Their expressions shifted from arrogance to surprise, then wary assessment. Hank, standing by the horses, reached for his gun. "Well now," McBride said, his smirk returning, though his eyes were sharp. "Looks like we got a visitor. Didn't know this town still attracted pretty things." His gaze was insolent, dismissive. Jane ignored him, her eyes fixed on Donovan. He was the one who'd likely done the burning, the killing. McBride gave the orders, but Donovan carried them out. "Jane Callahan," she said, her voice clear and strong. McBride's smirk faltered. Donovan's hand froze on his gun. They knew the name. Perhaps they had heard whispers of the woman who rode the plains, making a name for herself in rough company. Or perhaps the name simply reminded them of the family they had murdered. "Callahan," McBride tilted his head. "Ah, yes, the family on the ridge. Shame about that fire. Careless lot, leaving lamps burning, I suppose." A cold, hard laugh escaped Jane's lips. It held no humor. "You know damn well how that fire started, McBride." Donovan's eyes narrowed. "You got business here, woman? This town's ours now." "My business," Jane said, her hand hovering near the butt of her right Colt, "is with you, both of you." Hank, by the horses, drew his pistol. "Get back, lady." Jane didn't look at him. Her gaze was locked on Donovan. "You killed my mother. You killed my father." The words were not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. A prelude. Amos McBride spread his hands, trying for casualness, but tension radiating from him. "Now hold on, little lady. There's been misunderstandings. Things happen out here. Things happen, Jane repeated, her voice dangerously soft. And now, this is what happens now. Her right hand moved like lightning, drawing the Colt in a fluid, practiced motion. The hammer cocked back with a sharp click that seemed deafening in the silence. Hank, quicker on the draw than McBride or Donovan expected, fired first. The shot went wide, kicking up dust near Jane's boots. But Jane wasn't shooting at Hank. Her first shot was aimed squarely at Garrett Donovan's chest. He was fast, faster than McBride, but not fast enough. The bullet struck him with a sickening thud. His eyes widened in surprise and pain. He stumbled back, hand going to his chest, blood blooming dark on his shirt. Amos McBride, stunned for a fraction of a second, finally reacted, fumbling for the pistol in his belt. Jane's second shot was for him. She didn't aim to kill, not yet. The bullet struck his gun hand. He screamed, dropping the pistol, clutching his shattered fingers. Hank fired again, this time hitting Jane in the left arm. The impact sent a jolt of pain up her side, but her focus didn't waver. She ducked behind a water trough, the wood splintering as more shots rang out from Hank. "Get her, you idiot," McBride shrieked, clutching his hand. Donovan, staggering, drew a second pistol with his left hand and began firing wildly towards Jane's position. Jane peered around the edge of the trough, her left arm throbbing. Blood stained her duster. She grit her teeth against the pain. This wasn't going to be clean, it rarely was. Hank was trying to reload his revolver. Donovan was a bigger threat, wounded but still capable. McBride was incapacitated, but his mind was still sharp. She needed to neutralize Donovan quickly. He was fueled by pain and blind rage now. Waiting for a lull in the firing, she darted out from behind the trough, sprinting across the open street towards the saloon. Bullets whizzed past her head, one grazing her cheek. She reached the cover of the saloon's false front, pressing herself against the wall, heart hammering. Donovan was still firing, trying to pinpoint her location. McBride was shouting orders, his voice raw with pain and fury. Hank finished reloading and stepped out from behind the horses, taking aim. Cora. Where was Cora? Had she stayed hidden? Jane risked a glance around the corner. Donovan was standing upright now, swaying slightly, aiming down the street. Hank was advancing cautiously. McBride was slumped against the saloon wall, gasping. She had them separated, Hank and Donovan in the open, McBride injured. Taking a deep breath, Jane kicked the saloon door open, bursting into the dusty interior. It was dark, empty, smelling of stale beer and despair. She ran through to the back door, threw it open, and emerged into the alley. She circled around, using the buildings as cover, moving silently. She could hear the shouting of McBride, the heavy breathing of Donovan, the crunch of Hank's boots. She emerged back onto the main street, further down. Hank was focused on the saloon entrance. Donovan was still scanning the street, his face pale, but his eyes burning with lethal intent. "Hey, Hank," Jane yelled, her voice echoing. Hank spun around, startled. He raised his pistol, but before he could fire, Jane shot him in the shoulder. He cried out, staggering back, dropping his gun. Donovan, alerted, swung towards her, raising his pistol. Jane didn't hesitate. This time, she aimed to kill. The bullet hit him square in the forehead. His eyes went wide for a split second before glazing over. He dropped to the ground, lifeless. Only McBride was left. He was staring in horror at Donovan's body, then at Jane, his face contorted with pain and sudden, raw fear. He fumbled with his belt with his good hand, searching for a knife or another weapon. Jane walked slowly towards him, the Colt still smoking in her hand. Her arm throbbed, her cheek stung, but the icy calm had returned. "Don't," McBride whimpered, shrinking back against the wall. "Please, we can make a deal. Money, anything." "Money?" Jane scoffed. "You think this is about money?" She stopped a few feet away, looking down at the man who had ordered the death of her family, who had choked the life out of her home. The rage was still there, but it was sharper, colder now. It was no longer just grief, it was justice. "You took everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You took lives, you took hope." I just wanted to build something," McBride stammered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. "A profitable town, Your family resisted. They lived here, Jane said simply. They had a right. She raised the Colt, aiming it at his chest. No, wait, McBride cried, closing his eyes, bracing himself. But the shot didn't come. Jane lowered the pistol slightly, her hand shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of restraint. Killing him would be easy, satisfying in a brutal, immediate way. But would it bring back her parents? Would it heal the brokenness in this town? She looked past McBride, at the desolate street, at the boarded-up buildings, at the quiet fear she knew still lingered in the hearts of the few who remained. Killing him wouldn't fix any of that. It would just be one more death in a place already full of them. You'll leave, she said, her voice firm. You'll ride out of this valley, and you will never ever return. You understand? McBride opened his eyes, staring at her in disbelief. Leave? Now, Jane said, gesturing with the Colt towards the edge of town. And if I ever see your face again, anywhere in this territory, I won't miss next time. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his shattered hand, casting a terrified glance at Donovan's body, and the wounded Hank groaning in the dust. He didn't need telling twice. He stumbled towards the horses, ignoring Hank, fumbling with a saddle with his good hand. He mounted awkwardly, spurred the animal, and rode out of town like the devil himself was on his heels. Jane watched him go, a strange emptiness settling in her chest. Vengeance denied, at least in its most brutal form. Was this what healing felt like? Not a fiery triumph, but a quiet, almost anticlimactic act of letting go of the need for blood. Hank, moaning in the dust, was less of a threat now. Jane walked over to him. He flinched as she approached. Your boss is gone, she said. Donovan is dead. If you're smart, you'll get on your horse, if you can manage it, and ride out the other way. Tell anyone who asks what happened here. Tell them this town is no longer under McBride and Donovan's thumb. Hank just stared at her, pain and fear in his eyes. Jane didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back towards the general store. As she neared the door, Cora emerged, her face pale, but her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and astonishment. She had seen it all. You let him go, Cora breathed. Killing him wouldn't have changed anything, Jane said, pressing a hand to her wounded arm. It was a dull ache now, overshadowed by the strange quietness inside her. He'll live with knowing. That's its own kind of justice. Cora looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the hardened warrior, but the woman beneath, carrying her grief and making a difficult choice. Your arm is bleeding, Cora said, her voice soft with concern. It's fine, Jane said, though she knew it wasn't. It needed cleaning and bandaging. Come inside, Cora said, taking a hesitant step towards her. Let me help you. Jane looked at the offer of kindness, small but significant, in the desolate street. She looked at Cora's outstretched hand, symbolizing a tentative connection in a world that had offered little but pain and isolation. It wasn't the welcome she had imagined, not a joyous return to family and home. But it was a beginning, a chance to build something new from the ashes. She nodded, a silent acceptance. All right, Cora. They went inside the store, leaving the bodies and the dust behind. The fire still flickered, offering a small patch of warmth in the gloom. Cora carefully cleaned Jane's wound, her touch gentle. Jane watched her, the stoic facade beginning to crack around the edges. They're gone now, Cora said, looking up at her. Amos, Garrett, what happens now? Jane leaned back, the pain in her arm a steady beat against the returning ache in her heart. Now, she said softly, looking around the empty store, we start over. Starting over in a place so steeped in loss felt like an impossible task. The valley remained beautiful in its stark, unforgiving way, but the weight of the past pressed down on it like the heavy sky. The remaining townsfolk were hesitant, wary of believing the nightmare was truly over. They had been let down, threatened, and abused for too long. Jane didn't expect gratitude or celebration. She understood their fear. She had lived with her own ghosts for years. Instead of waiting for them, she and Cora simply began. They cleaned the general store, clearing out the debris and decay. They patched the roof, boarded up broken windows. It was slow, back-breaking work, done mostly in silence, punctuated by the creak of boards and the whisper of the wind. As they worked, the silence between them began to change. It was no longer filled with wary observation or unspoken grief, but with a quiet understanding. They learned each other's rhythms, anticipating needs without words. Cora's initial fear of Jane melted away, replaced by a quiet respect and a burgeoning affection. Jane, in turn, found herself lowering her guard around Cora, allowing small pieces of her formidable walls to crumble. One afternoon, while patching the store's leaking roof, Jane paused, looking out over the valley. The spot where her parents' cabin had stood was just a blackened scar on the landscape. The familiar ache tightened in her chest. Cora, sorting through salvageable goods below, looked up. "Thinking about them?" she asked softly. Jane nodded. "Always." "They would be proud of you, Jane," Cora said, "for coming back, for doing what you did." "What I did," Jane said, a flicker of the recent confrontation in her mind, "was messy, and not the way some would expect." "It was right," Cora said firmly. "Leaving him alive, it was hard, wasn't it?" Jane looked down at Cora, surprised by her insight. "Aye," she admitted. "Harder than killing him would have been. But maybe living with what he did is worse for him than dying," Cora mused. "And maybe you not killing him means you didn't let him take that part of you too, the part that chooses something else." Jane considered her words. Choosing not to kill McBride hadn't felt like mercy. It had felt like a different kind of burden, a refusal to be fully consumed by the darkness that had driven her for so long. Cora's words, however, offered a perspective Jane hadn't considered. Maybe it was a step towards reclaiming herself. Slowly, hesitantly, other townsfolk began to emerge. Old Man Davies brought them a pail of fresh water from his well. Martha Shaw, her face etched with sorrow, came to the store, offering to help clean in exchange for some salvage supplies. They were like frightened mice, peeking out of their holes, testing the air. Jane didn't push them. She simply kept working, letting her actions speak louder than words. She didn't fit their mold of a woman or a hero. She was too rough, too scarred, too independent. But she had rid them of their oppressors, and in the quiet, persistent act of trying to rebuild, she offered them something they hadn't had in years, a tangible sign of hope. The winter of 1887 settled in early, harsh, and biting. The work slowed, but didn't stop. Jane and Cora huddled by the fire, rationing supplies, the small store becoming their sanctuary. The forced proximity deepened their bond. They talked for hours, sharing stories, fears, and quiet dreams for a future that felt fragile but possible. Cora learned about Jane's travels, her unexpected encounters with kindness, the moments of profound loneliness, the fierce independence that had been both her shield and her cage. Jane learned about Cora's quiet strength, her resilience forged in solitude and hardship, her simple desire for a safe place to belong. One night, a fierce blizzard raged outside, rattling the windows. The wind howled like a grieving spirit. Cora shivered, pulling a thin blanket tighter. Jane, sitting opposite her, hesitated for a moment, then rose. She walked over to her saddlebags, rummaged inside, and pulled out a thick, warm buffalo robe. It was a prized possession, something she had earned the hard way. She spread it over Cora. Cora looked up, her eyes wide with surprise and gratitude. "Jane," she whispered, "you don't have to." I do," Jane said, sitting back down. "You've got as much right to be warm as I do." It was a simple act, a small exchange of warmth in the face of a brutal storm, but it felt significant. It was a tangible demonstration of the quiet connection that had grown between them, a silent promise of shared burdens and unexpected protection. As winter wore on, the few remaining families in the valley began to rely on Jane and Cora. Jane used her skills, honed by years of making do, to help patch leaky roofs, mend broken fences, trade salvaged goods fairly. She was still rough around the edges, quick to anger when injustice reared its head, but she was also fair and unexpectedly gentle with those who had suffered. Her reputation, once based on wild tales and exaggerated exploits, began to change. The battle-hardened Calamity Jane, known for shooting first and asking questions later, was showing a different side, one built on quiet strength, fierce loyalty, and a deep-seated need to protect the vulnerable. The spring of 1888 arrived, melting the snow and bringing a hesitant green to the valley. The silence of the town began to fill with the sounds of life again, the hammer of a nail, the distant lowing of cattle, the careful conversation of neighbors. They weren't a bustling community yet, and the scars of the past remained. But there was a sense of tentative rebirth. Jane and Cora had reopened the general store, stocking it with goods Jane managed to trade for on a cautious trip to the nearest settlement. It was a hub, a place where people could gather, share news, and feel a little less alone. One sunny afternoon, Old Man Davies sat outside the store, whittling. Martha Shaw and a few other women were inside, sorting supplies. Cora was tending a small vegetable patch she had started behind the store. Jane sat on the porch cleaning her rifle, watching the life slowly returning to the valley. She was still Jane Callahan, weathered and armed, carrying the weight of her past. The grief for her parents was a constant companion, a quiet ache she suspected would never fully disappear. But it no longer consumed her. The fire that had burned with vengeance had softened into a steady warmth, fueled by purpose and the quiet bond she shared with Cora. She looked at Cora, her hair tied back, dirt on her hands, a small smile on her face as she coaxed tiny green shoots from the earth. Cora had found her footing again, her resilience blossoming now that the shadow of McBride and Donovan was gone. Jane realized then that her return, driven by vengeance, had led her not to a final destructive act, but to something else entirely. It had led her back to the possibility of belonging, to the quiet strength of rebuilding, to the unexpected comfort of shared silence and gentle kindness. The world was still a harsh and unpredictable place. Danger lurked beyond the peaks that guarded the valley. But here, in this small, broken town, a different kind of life was taking root. A life built on the ashes of the past, nurtured by resilience and the fierce, quiet protection of a battle-hardened woman who had finally found a place to lay down her armor, at least for a little while. She was still a calamity, perhaps, but now she was also a cornerstone. And in the quiet hum of the rebuilding town, surrounded by the tentative return of life, Jane Callahan felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt home. The sun began to dip below the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The wind, which had been a cruel reminder of the world's indifference, seemed softer now, rustling gently through the newly leafed trees along the creek. Cora came up to the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Looks like we'll have carrots this year," she said, a note of quiet triumph in her voice. "Good," Jane replied, sliding the cleaned rifle into its scabbard. "Need something fresh." They sat together on the porch steps, watching the light fade. It was a simple moment, unremarkable to an outsider, but to them, it was everything. It was the quiet rhythm of a life being stitched back together, thread by painstaking thread. Word had spread through the territory about what had happened in the valley. Some called Jane a hero, others a cold-blooded killer. Most just stayed away, wary of the legendary figure and the violence that seemed to follow her. But here, in this valley, among these few souls who had suffered and survived, her story was different. It was the story of a return, a reckoning, and a choice. There would be challenges ahead. The land was hard, the seasons unforgiving. Other opportunists might try to fill the void left by McBride and Donovan. But for the first time in a long time, Jane didn't feel like she had to face it all alone. She glanced at Cora, who was watching the last light touch the mountaintops. There was a peace in her posture, a loosening of the tension that had held her captive for years. "You planning on staying, Jane?" Cora asked, her voice hesitant, as if afraid to break the fragile spell of the moment. Jane was silent for a long moment, the answer forming not in words, but in the settled feeling in her chest, the sense of belonging that had taken root alongside the carrots in Cora's garden. "Aye, Cora," she said softly, looking out at the valley that was slowly, painfully healing. "I believe I am." The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the valley into twilight. A few lamps flickered on in the windows of the scattered homes. The sounds of life, small and fragile, continued, a baby crying, a door closing, a quiet conversation. Jane Callahan, the woman they called Calamity, sat on the porch of her reclaimed home, the taste of dust and justice on her tongue, the warmth of a tentative connection at her side. The vengeance she had sought had not been the end of her journey, but a brutal, necessary turning point. The real fight, the one for healing and hope, had just begun. And for the first time in years, she faced it with a quiet readiness, no longer just a solitary rider in the storm, but a part of something fragile, resilient, and enduring.